My sister sent a message to the family group chat at 12:15 inches the morning, demanding that I wire her $18,500 for her son's 18th birthday party. She attached photos of a VIP ballroom at the most exclusive private club in Manhattan, a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, and a cake that cost $2,500. Her instruction was simple and completely devoid of any basic human decency. Pay the final bill before 8 a.m. or you will ruin my nephew's big day. I replied with exactly 3 words: get a job. Less than 15 minutes later, my father was screaming at me over the phone, threatening to disinherit me while my mother cried about family loyalty. Then, my white brother-in-law snatched the receiver to condescendingly explain that a simple party planner like me just didn't understand how high society worked. They demanded I swipe my credit card to save their image. They didn't have the faintest idea that I didn't just plan parties at that exclusive club. I owned the entire building. And at 6:12 the next morning, they would discover exactly what happens when you cross the line from familial entitlement to federal wire fraud. The digital clock on my desk read exactly 11:45 on a Thursday night. I was sitting at the massive imported mahogany desk in my financial district penthouse, reviewing the quarterly revenue projections for my commercial real estate and hospitality holding group. The New York City lights shone brightly through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a silent, glowing reminder of the corporate empire I had meticulously built from absolute nothing over the last decade. My journey to this penthouse had been paved with blood, sweat, and relentless determination. While my older sister, Madison, was handed everything on a silver platter, I worked 80 hours a week, building a hospitality empire from scratch. I sacrificed my 20s to ensure I would never have to depend on anyone else. And yet, no matter how high I climbed, my family still looked at me and saw the struggling younger sister who was only good for a quick cash grab. The silence of my office was suddenly shattered when my phone vibrated violently against the wood surface. It was the Vance family group chat. I had muted the conversation months ago, exhausted by the constant demands and drama, but I still saw the notification banners lighting up my screen in rapid succession. Madison, my 38-year-old sister, had sent a flurry of high-resolution photos. The first image showed the grand ballroom of the Astor Room. It is widely known as the most expensive and restricted private club in all of New York City, catering exclusively to old money and ultra-high net worth individuals. The second photo showed my 18-year-old nephew, Mason, standing in front of a luxury tailor's mirror, trying on a custom-cut Tom Ford suit. The third image was a digital rendering of a 6-tier cake bathed in edible gold leaf, with a $2,500 price tag clearly visible in the corner of the screen. Then came Madison's text. It read, "Jessica, I need you to wire $18,500 to cover the final catering and venue bill for Mason's birthday party. The money has to be in their account before 8 a.m. tomorrow morning or they won't unlock the ballroom doors. Do not make me chase you for this. Do not ruin your nephew's big day." I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I didn't feel shock or surprise. I only felt a deep, exhausting, and familiar weariness. This was Madison in her purest form. She lived in a constant, draining state of fabricated luxury. She drove a leased Range Rover she could barely afford. She carried designer bags bought with high-interest credit cards and spent hours curating her social media presence. She desperately wanted the world to see her as the Upper East Side elite, but her reality was a mountain of crushing debt. And as always, she expected me to foot the bill to maintain her absolute delusion. I typed my reply, letting the cold truth guide my fingers, and hit send without a second thought. Get a job. I tossed my phone face down on the desk and picked up my pen, ready to get back to my revenue reports. I knew exactly what was coming next. The toxic family dynamic had been identical since we were little girls. Madison was the golden child who simply could do no wrong. She was the star, the beautiful one, the one who married William, a white loan officer who loved to rub his mediocre salary and perceived superiority in our faces. I was the scapegoat, the invisible younger sister who, according to their narrative, just worked odd jobs and arranged flowers for local events. They viewed my life as a pathetic little side hustle. They didn't have the faintest idea that my event logistics company had quietly acquired massive commercial real estate properties across the East Coast. They thought I lived in a tiny rented apartment and barely made ends meet. I deliberately preferred it that way. It kept their greedy, diminishing hands off my actual bank accounts. My phone started ringing frantically less than 2 minutes later. The caller ID showed my father, Charles. I let it ring 3 times, listening to the aggressive vibration against the desk before finally pressing the speaker button. "Jessica, What is wrong with you? My father bellowed, his deep voice echoing sharply off the glass walls of my office. Your sister is under an immense amount of stress organizing this monumental event for Mason, and you have the absolute audacity to disrespect her in the group chat like that. You are going to wire that money right now. Do you hear me? You do not speak to your older sister that way. My father had always protected Madison, shielding her from the consequences of her own terrible decisions. He enabled her delusions of grandeur because it made him feel like the patriarch of a successful, wealthy dynasty. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, keeping my breathing perfectly measured. Dad, I am not paying $18,500 for a birthday party. That is completely insane. Mason doesn't even have a part-time job. He doesn't need a custom Tom Ford suit or a gold cake to celebrate turning 18. Besides, Madison has no right to demand that kind of money from me as if I were her personal ATM. My mother, Barbara, snatched the phone. She was the architect of this entire toxic structure, always wielding guilt like a master tactician. I could hear her sharp, ragged breathing through the speaker. Jessica, you listen to me right now. You are embarrassing this entire family. Do you have any idea who is going to be at this party tomorrow? William invited senior partners from his bank. Madison invited the entire board of the Homeowners Association. If that venue bill isn't paid by morning, they will look like complete fools in front of everyone who matters. It is $18,500. You don't have a husband to support. You don't have children to feed or clothe. What exactly are you doing with your money anyway? Buying cheap ribbons and balloons for those little birthday parties you throw? I squeezed my eyes shut, pinching the bridge of my nose. The sheer entitlement radiating through the phone was physically suffocating. Mom, just because I don't have a husband doesn't mean my bank account belongs to Madison and William. If they want to host senior bank partners at a place like the Astor Room, they can pay for it themselves. You cannot throw a luxury party on a fast food budget and then demand I bail you out. You are so incredibly selfish, my mother cried, her voice taking on that familiar, dramatic whine she used whenever she needed to manipulate a situation. You have always been deeply jealous of your sister. Are you jealous that she has a handsome provider for a husband and a beautiful son? You just do these little side jobs, organizing parties and running errands for restaurant managers all day while she builds a real, respectable life. You should feel deeply honored that she is allowing you to contribute to your nephew's most important milestone. If you don't pay this bill right now, you are no longer part of this family. We will cut you off completely, Jessica. You will have no one. Before I could process the sheer absurdity of my mother's threat, a new voice came through the speaker. It was William. He had obviously taken the phone from my mother and put himself in charge of the conversation. His tone was infuriatingly calm, dripping with that specific brand of unearned confidence and racial condescension he always reserved especially for me. Listen, Jessica, William said slowly, dragging out my name as if he were speaking to a slow child who had just spilled a glass of milk. You clearly don't understand how high society works or how investments are made. You are a manual laborer. You run errands. You set up chairs. You simply do not grasp the complex mechanics of elite networking. This party is an investment in Mason's future. It is a networking opportunity that will open crucial doors for him, doors that you, frankly, will never be able to walk through because of your limited career path. I remained perfectly silent, letting him dig his own monumental grave. William took my silence as his cue and pushed forward, his ego inflating with every word. You see, Jessica, wealth creation requires leveraging assets. We are leveraging this event to position Mason within the upper echelons of New York's elite society. It is all about the return on investment. You can't comprehend the ROI of a properly executed luxury event because you spend your days haggling over the price of cheap tablecloths. I know $18,500 sounds like a massive amount of money to someone living paycheck to paycheck doing odd jobs. But in the corporate banking world, this is pocket change. It is just a basic cash flow issue. We have our capital tied up in high-yield investments right now. Therefore, our liquidity is temporarily restricted. All you have to do is swipe your credit card tomorrow morning to release the hold on the venue. I will personally sit down with you next week and teach you how to manage your personal finances so you can rebuild your credit after this. Consider it a favor from me to you, a white savior moment for the struggling sister-in-law. So let me understand this completely, I said, my voice dangerously low and steady, cutting through his arrogant monologue. You want me to max out my supposed low-limit credit cards to pay for your son's luxury party because your money is tied up? And in exchange, you will give me a free financial literacy lesson. Exactly, William said, sounding incredibly pleased with himself. See? You are finally getting it. Just pay the bill before 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Jessica, be a team player for once in your miserable life instead of being so stubborn and narrow-minded. Your errand-running job will never pay for a $2,500 cake anyway. So put it on a credit card and let the real adults handle the rest. I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call immediately. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't try to explain that my supposed errand-running job had generated over $40 million in pure profit last year. I didn't need to defend myself to a man who barely made $60,000 a year while drowning in consumer debt. I sat in the silence of my penthouse, the cold blue glow of my computer monitors illuminating the dark room. William's condescending words echoed in my head. He was so incredibly arrogant. So absolutely certain he was the smartest person in the room, simply because of his gender and his race. I turned my attention to my 3-monitor setup. I opened a new secure browser tab and typed in the administrative URL for the Astor Room's property management system. My family thought I only arranged flowers and negotiated basic vendor contracts for local venues. They didn't have the faintest idea that my corporate holding group had purchased the Astor Room in its entirety 3 months ago, in a massive, all-cash, multi-million-dollar acquisition. I bypassed the standard employee login and used my chief executive credentials to access the venue's deepest financial records. I opened the upcoming events calendar for the weekend and clicked on the private booking listed under Mason Miller. The digital file opened instantly, displaying the premium catering package, the security deposit requirements, and the outstanding balance. But as my eyes scanned the digital contract, my blood ran completely cold. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The silence of the penthouse suddenly felt deafening. There, at the very bottom of the legal document, under the section explicitly titled Financial Guarantor, was my name, Jessica Vance. And right next to it, securely uploaded into the financial system, was a digital signature. It was a blatant, complete, and undeniable forgery. My heart beat at a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs as I analyzed the forged document. The signature was a decent copy of the one I used on basic family greeting cards, but it lacked the specific, confident flourishes I used for legally binding corporate documents. William, working at a bank, must have thought he was a genius figuring out how to bypass the initial security deposit by putting my name on the hook. He assumed that once the party started, I would be too embarrassed by social pressure to dispute the charges. He assumed I would simply absorb the financial hit to protect the family name, just like my parents always did. He assumed wrong. Very, very wrong. They hadn't just texted me to ask for money. They hadn't just tried to bully me into paying for a luxury party. They had already stolen my identity and committed federal wire fraud. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a cold, hard knot of pure resolution form in my chest. My family had finally crossed the line from toxic entitlement to actual criminal behavior, and they were about to learn exactly what happens when you try to scam the person who owns the building. The morning sun barely pierced through the frosted glass of my small storefront on the edge of Queens. The faded gold lettering on the door read Vance Event Logistics. It was a space no larger than a standard living room, containing 2 basic desks, a filing cabinet, and some floral arrangement binders. My family thought this was the entirety of my existence. They believed I spent my days here haggling over wholesale ribbon prices and begging local vendors for discounts. They had no idea this modest office was nothing more than a carefully constructed decoy, a physical boundary I maintained, specifically to keep their insatiable greed miles away from my actual holding group headquarters in Manhattan. I sat behind the scratched laminate desk, sipping black coffee, perfectly calm. I had barely slept, but my mind was operating with razor-sharp precision. The digital copy of the forged contract burned in my memory. I knew they were coming. The arrogance of what William had done practically guaranteed they would show up in person to ensure their trap snapped shut. Right on time, at 9 a.m., the cheap brass bell above the front door jingled loudly. They didn't just walk in, they invaded the small space. My father, Charles, led the pack with his chest puffed out in a tailored golf shirt. My mother, Barbara, followed closely, clutching her designer bag like a shield of superiority. Madison marched in, looking utterly exhausted by the mere act of stepping into a working-class neighborhood, and bringing up the rear was William. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit and a smug expression that instantly made my blood pressure spike. He looked around my modest office and visibly sneered, brushing dust off a fake plant near the entrance. "Well, this place is certainly depressing," Madison sighed loudly, dropping her massive sunglasses into her purse. Jessica, it smells like old paper and cheap coffee in here. Can we make this quick? I have a spa appointment at 11 to get ready for the party tonight. I remained seated, keeping my hands neatly folded on the desk. What can I do for you, Madison? I thought I made my position very clear last night. My father slammed his hand on my desk, rattling my coffee mug. You do not dictate terms to this family, he barked, his voice steeped in that familiar toxic authority. We are here because you are going to stop playing these petty games and fulfill your obligations. Madison is hosting the most important social event of the year for your nephew, and you are trying to humiliate us over a simple catering bill. My mother stepped forward, shaking her head with an exaggerated expression of deep disappointment. Jessica, we did not raise you to be so spiteful. We raised you to support your blood. William has generously handled all the venue negotiations for us so Madison wouldn't have to stress. The least you can do is take care of the final venue fee. It is your duty as an aunt. I looked at William. He was leaning against the filing cabinet, arms crossed, radiating pure, unearned confidence. He gave me a condescending smile and took a deliberate step forward, inserting himself between my parents and me. Let's talk facts, Jessica, William said, using that low, slow voice he reserved for when he felt the need to educate me. I know you got emotional last night, so I am going to spell this out for you simply. When I set up the contract with the Astor Room, they required a registered financial guarantor to secure the booking. Since my capital is currently tied up in some aggressive market yields, I went ahead and put your primary business credit card down as the guarantor account. He said it so casually. He confessed to felony identity theft, as if he were explaining how to order a latte. I kept my face completely expressionless. You put my name and my credit card down without my permission. William chuckled, shaking his head as if my ignorance was truly exhausting. It is a standard placeholder, Jessica. Don't act so naive. But here is the reality of your current situation. The venue requires the final payment of $18,500 to be authorized on that exact card today. If you try to call your bank and block the charge, or if you claim fraud, the venue will automatically report the entire account to collections. It will trigger a severe default, a massive hit to your credit score. William leaned over my desk, invading my personal space. With a business as small and fragile as yours, a default like that will completely destroy your borrowing power. You won't be able to get a loan for a new printer, let alone keep this little shop open. You will be bankrupt by the end of the quarter, so you are going to authorize the charge. You will pay the bill, and I will graciously agree to pay you back in monthly installments once my investments mature. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement. Do you see how reasonable he is being, Jessica? He is offering to pay you back. 2 years ago, your father and I took out a second mortgage on our house to help William expand his consulting firm. We didn't hesitate. We didn't throw a tantrum. We signed the papers because that is how generational wealth is built. You invest in the people who actually have the capacity to succeed. We sacrificed for the greater good of this family. You need to stop being so incredibly selfish and do your part. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the stale air of the office. My parents had secretly remortgaged the house they had lived in for 30 years just to fund William's delusional fantasies of being a corporate genius. And now, because they had exhausted their own resources, they expected me to absorb the financial hit for Madison's ridiculous lifestyle. They were using me as a human shield to protect the white son-in-law they worshipped. I slowly pulled my tablet out of the desk drawer. My screen was already connected to the secure administrative backend of the Astor Room. While William continued to lecture me about the importance of maintaining a pristine credit score, I silently opened the exact itemized invoice for Mason's 18th birthday party. My eyes scanned the digital rows of numbers. I intimately knew the pricing structure of my own venue. The Platinum Tier event package, which included the grand ballroom rental, premium catering, security, and waitstaff, came to a flat fee of exactly $5,000. I scrolled further down. There was a manual override added to the contract by the client. It was listed as a third-party vendor payout. The amount was exactly $13,500. My mind crunched the raw data instantly. The venue was only charging $5,000. The rest of the money, the massive $18,500 total they were demanding I wire, was mostly fake. William had deliberately altered the terms of the contract. He was using the venue's billing system to process a massive overcharge on my card, with the intention of having the venue hand the $13,500 difference directly back to him in cash as a supposed vendor payment. He wasn't just trying to score a free party. He was using my nephew's birthday as a front to launder $13,500 straight out of my bank account. I looked up from the screen. My gaze drifted from William's smug face to my mother's desperate, defensive posture, and finally to my father's stern, unforgiving glare. A sudden, chilling realization washed over me. My parents knew. They might not have understood the exact digital mechanics of the wire fraud, but they absolutely knew William was severely in debt. They knew he needed a massive cash injection immediately. They were fully aware that this entire setup was extortion. They were willingly feeding me to the wolves to prevent William's failures from becoming public and ruining their fake upper-class facade. Jessica, stop staring at that screen and listen to your brother-in-law, Madison snapped, snapping her fingers in my direction. The party starts at 4. I need you to go to the Astor room and physically swipe the card with their general manager. Do not try to do it over the phone. They need the physical chip read for an amount that large. Just go do it and stop making my life so difficult. I swear, you ruin everything you touch. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch out. I looked at the 4 of them standing in my decoy office, entirely convinced they held all the power. They believed they had outsmarted the uneducated sister. They thought I was trapped by the fear of financial ruin and family obligation. I let my shoulders slump slightly forward. I lowered my gaze to the desk, mastering the exact posture of a defeated, broken woman who had finally realized she had no way out. I let out a long, shaky sigh. You're right, I said, my voice quiet and appropriately fragile. I can't afford a default on my business credit. I don't have the legal resources to fight a venue like the Astor Room if they send me to collections. William clapped his hands together. A broad, victorious smile spread across his face. There we go. I knew you would finally see the logic once the commercial implications were explained to you. It's just basic economics, Jessica. I kept my eyes down. Fine, I will go to the venue this afternoon. I will meet with the manager and swipe the card for the full $18,500. But I want it in writing that you will pay me back, William. William laughed, a loud, booming sound of pure condescension. Absolutely. I'll draft a promissory note next week. See, Barbara? I told you she just needed a little push in the right direction. My mother smoothed down her designer jacket, looking deeply relieved. Thank goodness. Now Madison can focus on getting ready for tonight. Jessica, make sure you dress presentably when you go to the venue. We don't want the staff thinking our family is affiliated with the help. You can just do the transaction and go home. Do not linger around the party tonight. It is an exclusive guest list and we don't need you making things awkward with your bad mood. I nodded meekly. I understand. I will just handle the payment and leave. My father gave me a stern nod of approval. Good. It is about time you started acting like a supportive member of this family. Let's go, everyone. We have a lot of preparations left. They marched out of the office just as loudly as they had entered, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and toxic arrogance in their wake. I listened to the brass bell jingle as the door shut. I waited exactly 30 seconds, watching through the frosted glass until their luxury SUV pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the street. The moment they were gone, my defeated posture vanished instantly. I sat perfectly straight, my spine like steel. I reached across the desk and grabbed my phone, dialing a private, encrypted number. It rang only twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. Audit desk, David speaking. David, it's Jessica. I need you to initiate a full, covert financial trace immediately, I said, my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. The target is my brother-in-law, William Miller. I need a comprehensive sweep of all his active accounts, hidden liabilities, and covert credit lines. I suspect he is deeply entangled with unauthorized private lenders or illegal syndicates. He is currently attempting to force a $13,500 cash extraction through a fraudulent vendor payment at the Astor Room. I want to know exactly whose pockets that money is supposed to end up in this afternoon. Understood, boss, David replied, typing rapidly in the background. I will have a full financial autopsy on your desk in 2 hours. What is the play regarding the venue contract? I stood up from the cheap desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city I practically owned. Do not touch the contract yet. Let them think the trap is working. I am going to go to the venue this afternoon and play my part to perfection. Let him dig the hole as deep as possible. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. My family thought they had successfully cornered a helpless animal. They were about to discover they had just willingly walked into a slaughterhouse, The heavy silence of my decoy office settled around me the second the front door clicked shut behind my family. I sat perfectly still at my scratched laminate desk, listening to the faint hum of city traffic outside the frosted glass window. I had just instructed my chief financial auditor, David, to trace every transaction attached to my brother-in-law. David was a former forensic accountant who worked exclusively for my holding group and possessed an unparalleled ability to unearth buried financial secrets. I told him I needed the data immediately, and he promised to have a complete dossier on my secure server within an hour. I packed up my tablet, locked the small storefront, and hailed a car to take me to my true corporate headquarters in Manhattan. The ride allowed the crisp morning air to clear my head, but it did nothing to soothe the burning sensation in my chest. My family had shown up at my office and demanded I sacrifice my supposedly fragile credit to fund a luxury party they couldn't afford. They had treated my livelihood as an acceptable casualty for their social climb. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse suite and poured myself a mug of strong black coffee. The panoramic view of the downtown skyline usually brought me a sense of profound peace. But today the glass walls felt like an observation cage. I sat at my executive desk and stared at my encrypted monitors, waiting for the truth to arrive. The notification chime echoed in the large room exactly 45 minutes later. David had sent a highly secured file labeled with William's full legal name. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and punched in my decryption keys. The master spreadsheet opened, revealing a labyrinth of bank accounts, shell companies, and lines of credit. I am accustomed to analyzing complex corporate mergers and massive real estate acquisitions, but the sheer volume of chaotic data in William's personal file was staggering. I started at the point of origin, looking for the source of his current capital. David had highlighted a massive cash injection from 2 years ago. I clicked on the linked document and felt the breath leave my lungs. The money hadn't come from a bank loan or a venture capital firm. It was a direct wire transfer from a joint checking account belonging to my parents, Charles and Barbara Vance. I cross-referenced the date and the amount with the county property records. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Exactly 2 years prior, my parents had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on the house they had lived in for 3 decades. They had extracted every dime of equity they had spent their entire lives building and handed it all directly to William. This was the seed capital for Miller Innovation, the tech startup William had relentlessly bragged about at family dinners. He had strutted around in designer suits, belittling me about his brilliant entrepreneurial vision while secretly draining my parents' retirement funds. I moved to the expense tab for his supposed startup, expecting to see payroll records, office lease agreements, and software development costs. Instead, I found a financial graveyard. The company account had been completely emptied within weeks of the initial deposit. William had not hired a single employee or developed a single product. He had taken my parents' life savings and funneled the money through a dizzying series of digital wallets and offshore accounts. David's forensic notes detailed the final destinations of these transfers. The money had poured into unregulated international sports betting syndicates, offshore crypto casinos, and high-stakes poker rooms. William was not a misunderstood entrepreneurial genius. He was a catastrophic gambling addict who had burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in a matter of months. When my parents' massive initial investment ran dry, the data showed he opened multiple high-limit credit cards in my sister Madison's name. He had systematically maxed out every single card on cash advances to chase his mounting losses. The financial crater he had dug for his family was so incredibly deep, they would never be able to climb out of it. But the most alarming information was highlighted in neon red at the bottom of the spreadsheet. I scrolled down, my eyes tracking the last 30 days of financial activity. William's standard accounts were all heavily overdrawn, but David had flagged a series of aggressive incoming deposits from a local group of predatory lenders. This wasn't a traditional bank or a standard payday loan company. This was an entity known for street-level lending, providing massive amounts of untraceable cash to desperate people at extortionate interest rates. William had borrowed $50,000 from these dangerous lenders last month, presumably to cover a massive gambling margin call. The terms of this illicit loan were meticulously documented in David's analysis. William was trapped in a predatory cycle that required him to make a brutal weekly interest payment just to keep the lenders from taking physical action against him. I looked at the exact dollar amount of the required weekly payment, and my blood ran entirely cold. The required payment was exactly $13,500. The numbers stared back at me from the screen, burning into my retinas. $13,500. It was the precise amount of the fake vendor payout William had secretly added to the catering contract for Mason's birthday party at my venue. The entire elaborate scam suddenly made perfect sense. The venue package only cost $5,000. William had deliberately altered the contract to demand $18,500 from my credit card, with the intention of using the venue's billing system to process the overcharge. He planned for the venue manager to hand the $13,500 discrepancy to him in cash out the back door, as a supposed vendor payment. He wasn't just trying to score a free party to maintain his fake wealthy lifestyle. He was cornered by dangerous loan sharks who demanded their weekly payment by tomorrow morning. If he didn't get that money, those men were going to come looking for him. He had orchestrated this massive fraud to steal the exact amount he needed to save his own kneecaps, and he had chosen me to be his unwitting human shield. He had forged my signature to force me to swipe my card, assuming I would simply absorb the massive debt out of family obligation. I pushed my chair away from the desk, the leather creaking loudly in the silent room. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. The wire fraud, the gambling, the extortion, it was all vile, but the darkest realization was slowly seeping into my mind like a paralyzing poison. My parents had to know. They were completely underwater with their own mortgage. David's report showed they were 2 months behind on their property payments. They were facing imminent foreclosure because of William. They knew his startup was a total failure. They knew he was drowning in debt. And yet, they had walked into my decoy office this morning and demanded I pay for this party. They had stood there and aggressively bullied me into swiping my card. My father had slammed my desk, demanding I do my duty. My mother had cried and called me selfish for hesitating. They knew William needed a massive amount of cash to survive, and they were perfectly willing to serve their youngest daughter up on a silver platter to provide it. The absolute magnitude of their betrayal made my stomach violently churn. My whole life I had endured their cruelty. I had accepted my role as the family scapegoat, the invisible sister, who was only good for running errands and taking the blame. I had always rationalized their behavior as simple favoritism. Madison was the golden child, and I was just the disappointment, but this was an entirely different level of violation. This was premeditated financial destruction. They were actively participating in a scheme to rob me blind just to protect the white son-in-law they held on a ridiculous pedestal. In their twisted reality, William's reputation and safety were worth infinitely more than my entire existence. He was the man who was supposed to elevate their social status, the one who made them feel adjacent to elite society. The fact that he was actually a criminal failure didn't matter to them. They were so blinded by their toxic worship of his perceived status that they were willing to sacrifice my livelihood to shield him from the consequences of his own addiction. My mother had looked me dead in the eye and told me I was embarrassing the family by refusing to pay. She was actively manipulating me while trying to rob me blind. My father had threatened to disinherit me if I didn't comply. They had chosen to save a man who ruined them over a daughter who had done nothing but work hard and stay out of the way. The pain of that realization was sharp and suffocating, but it extinguished almost as quickly as it flared. The deep, agonizing sting of parental betrayal was swiftly replaced by a cold, calculated fury. I walked back to my desk and stared at the glowing monitors. I now possessed the absolute holy trinity of vengeance. I had the forged contract proving William's identity theft. I had the full financial audit proving his embezzlement and illegal gambling, and I had the irrefutable knowledge of my parents' toxic complicity. They thought they were manipulating a naive, struggling event planner who would eventually cave to their aggressive demands. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who owned the very ground they stood on. I wiped a single tear from my cheek, brushing away the last vestige of the daughter they had completely destroyed. That girl was gone forever. I closed the spreadsheets and locked my computer terminal. It was time to get ready. Madison had ordered me to arrive at the Astor Room this afternoon to meet with the manager and swipe my card. She expected me to arrive with my head bowed, ready to accept my financial punishment. I walked into my private dressing room and selected an impeccable, bespoke power suit. I was going to go to the venue exactly as they demanded. I was going to stand quietly in the background and watch them revel in their fake luxury. I was going to let them feel the victory, let them enjoy every second of their stolen prestige, because the moment the clock struck 6:12 tomorrow morning, their entire fabricated universe was going to burn to the ground. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open, and I stepped out of the dimly lit service hallway, instantly adjusting my posture. I let my shoulders slump slightly, erasing the commanding presence that usually defined my stride. I transformed back into Jessica, the exhausted, obedient younger sister. The ballroom was magnificent. The late afternoon sun poured through the massive arched windows, catching the facets of the imported crystal chandeliers and casting a warm, brilliant glow over the polished marble floors. Staff members were putting the finishing touches on the tables, arranging the elaborate floral centerpieces I had personally approved weeks ago, even though my family believed Madison had designed them herself. Madison was standing by the DJ booth, aggressively pointing a manicured finger at a young technician. Mason was slouched in a plush velvet chair nearby, scrolling on his phone, the custom Tom Ford suit jacket now wrinkled beneath him. William was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in a restroom trying to suppress a panic attack. I took a deep breath, gripping my simple leather purse, and walked deliberately across the expansive floor. My heels clicked softly, but the sound was quickly absorbed by the ambient noise of event preparations. Madison saw me first. She stopped berating the DJ and planted her hands on her hips. A triumphant, superior smirk spread across her face. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," she called out, her voice loud enough to make several staff members turn their heads. "I was starting to think you were going to be stubborn enough to ruin your nephew's birthday." I stopped a few feet away from her, keeping my eyes slightly downcast, playing my part to absolute perfection. "I'm here, Madison. Where is the manager?" Mason didn't even look up from his phone. He simply scoffed, a short, ugly sound of pure disdain. "About time, Aunt Jessica. You better hurry up before they lock the doors and embarrass us." The sheer audacity of an 18-year-old boy speaking to me that way, especially when I was supposedly about to pull his entire family out of massive debt, was breathtaking. But I didn't react. I absorbed the disrespect carefully, filing it away in the vault of grievances I would soon empty. "Marcus is bringing the payment terminal out now," Madison said, waving her hand dismissively. "Just swipe your card and let's get this over with. William is dealing with some very sensitive financial calls, so you don't need to bother him. Just handle the transaction." Right on cue, Marcus appeared from the administrative wing. He walked with long, purposeful strides, carrying a sleek digital payment tablet and a leather-bound folio containing the contract. His face was a mask of perfect, impenetrable professionalism. He approached our small group, his eyes briefly meeting mine before shifting to Madison. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, his voice deep and resonant. "I understand we are ready to finalize the billing for tonight's event." "Yes," Madison said, stepping back and gesturing toward me with a theatrical flourish. "My sister will be taking care of the final invoice. Please make it quick." Marcus focused his attention on me. He opened the leather folio, revealing the final invoice. The bold black numbers stood out starkly against the pristine white paper. $18,500. The total remaining balance for the venue rental, premium catering, and the manual vendor payout is $18,500, Marcus stated clearly, ensuring the amount was spoken aloud for the record. I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my corporate credit card. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. By handing over this card, I was committing fully to the illusion. I was giving them exactly enough rope to hang themselves completely. I pulled out the card, a heavy, unmarked, solid black metal card that belonged to my primary holding group. Madison's eyes locked onto the card. A flicker of surprise registered on her face. She was used to seeing me with standard, low-limit bank cards. She didn't recognize this one, but she was too consumed by her own victory to question it. "Here you go," I said, my voice soft and restrained. I handed the card to Marcus. Marcus took the card with a solemn nod. He inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine beeped, processing the massive charge. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. I knew that somewhere in the building, William was sweating, waiting for confirmation that his desperate extortion scheme had worked. The terminal emitted a cheerful, melodic sequence. Approved. Marcus pulled the card out and handed it back to me along with a printed receipt. "The transaction is complete. The balance is settled. The Astor Room is yours for the evening." Madison let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, instantly transforming back into the arrogant socialite. "Finally," she said, practically snatching the receipt out of my hand before I could even look at it. "Now, Jessica, you need to leave. Guests will be arriving in an hour, and this is a formal, highly exclusive event. You are not dressed appropriately, and frankly, I do not want you lingering around with that bitter look on your face." She was dismissing me from my own building. She had squeezed the money out of me and was now kicking me out the back door, completely indifferent to the fact that I had supposedly ruined myself to save her son's party. "I understand," I said, slipping the card back into my purse. "I will leave." Mason finally looked up from his phone, a cruel, mocking smirk on his face. "Thanks for the cash, Aunt Jessica. Don't let the door hit you on the way out." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply turned my back on them and walked away. I crossed the grand ballroom with my head held high, the sound of my heels echoing on the marble. I felt their eyes on me. I felt their smug, victorious smiles burning into my back. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully gamed the system and exploited my supposed weakness. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the warm New York evening. I didn't go to my car. I didn't leave the premises. Instead, I circled the building, accessing a hidden, private entrance that led directly to my secure, soundproof owner's suite overlooking the ballroom. The suite was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, equipped with a wall of monitors tied into the venue's extensive security camera network. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, sat in the plush leather chair, and flicked on the screens. I had a perfect, high-definition, multi-angle view of the entire ballroom. I could see everything. I watched as the guests began to arrive. A parade of local business owners, minor politicians, and mid-level bank executives, all dressed in formal attire, entirely oblivious that the lavish party they were attending was funded by wire fraud and impending foreclosure. I watched Madison greet guests with exaggerated hugs and air kisses, playing the role of the wealthy, benevolent hostess. I watched Mason holding court with his friends, arrogant and oblivious. And then I watched William. He had emerged from wherever he had been hiding, but the relief he must have felt when the card was approved had clearly vanished. He was pacing near the rear exit, constantly checking his phone, his face a mask of barely contained panic. He kept looking toward the administrative wing, waiting for Marcus to walk out with the $13,500 in cash. He was going to be waiting a very long time. I leaned forward, tapping a few keys on my console. I pulled up the audio feed from Marcus's office. "Mr. Miller." Marcus's voice came through crisp and clear. "I have processed the payment. The venue is secured." "The cash?" William's voice was frantic, breathless. "Where is the cash? You said you would have it in the back." "I said the transaction would be handled according to our legal protocols," Marcus replied calmly. "The vendor payout will be processed as a certified check and mailed to the address provided on the invoice within 3 to 5 business days. We do not disperse large sums of cash under any circumstances." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I could almost hear the sound of William's entire world fracturing. "A check?" William's voice was a high, terrified squeak. 3 to 5 days? No. You can't do that. I need the cash now. Tonight. You don't understand. They are going to kill me." "I understand perfectly, Mr. Miller," Marcus said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "However, the Astor Room will not be a party to your financial indiscretions. The transaction is complete. Have a pleasant evening." I watched on the security camera as William stumbled backward, his hands clutching his head. He looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. The panic, the pure, unadulterated terror radiating from him was palpable, even through the screen. He had trapped himself. He had committed fraud, stolen from his family, and lied to everyone. And he still didn't have the money to save himself from the loan sharks. I leaned back in my leather chair. A cold, hard smile settled on my face. The party was in full swing beneath me. The music was bumping, the champagne was flowing, and the illusion of wealth was blindingly bright. But I knew the truth. I knew the foundation of their entire existence was crumbling beneath their feet. They had demanded I pay the price for their existence, and I had complied. But the bill was coming due at exactly 6:12 tomorrow morning, and I was going to make absolutely certain that none of them could afford the cost. I left the hidden security suite and made my way down the plush, carpeted hallway. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, holding the audio recording of William begging for his life. The sound of his panic was a sweet melody, but I didn't have time to savor it. I needed to get back down to the main floor before my absence was noted. The grand staircase curved downward to the main lobby, where the early arrivals were just beginning to mingle. I kept my face perfectly neutral, a mask of calm obedience I had perfected over 3 decades. As I rounded the corner near the coat check, my mother appeared. Seemingly out of nowhere, Barbara possessed a terrifying ability to locate me whenever she felt her control slipping. She was wearing a dark emerald green evening gown that clung to her figure, accessorized with fake diamond jewelry she had likely purchased on a high-interest installment plan. Her face was perfectly made up for the public, but the moment she made eye contact with me, her expression hardened into a mask of pure, desperate aggression. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm with such force that her manicured acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I simply looked at her hand and then up at her face. She leaned in close, her heavy floral perfume completely overpowering the subtle scent of the expensive venue. "What are you still doing here, Jessica?" she hissed under her breath, ensuring none of the passing guests could hear her toxic tone. "Madison told you to swipe the card and leave immediately. You are going to ruin the aesthetic of the evening lingering around here with that bitter face." I kept my voice low and perfectly monotone. "I was leaving, Mom." I had to wait for the final receipt to process. My mother didn't release my arm. Instead, her fingers tightened even further, and she began dragging me away from the main lobby. Her strength was fueled by pure panic. "We are going to have a little chat right now," she whispered harshly. She pulled me down a side corridor toward the luxury powder room. The hallway was lined with imported Italian marble and gold leaf mirrors, reflecting her frantic movements and my calm submission. She shoved open the heavy wooden door of the restroom and pulled me inside, letting the door swing shut with a heavy thud that echoed in the spacious room. The Astor Room's powder room was designed to feel like a sanctuary for the elite. The walls were covered in pale pink silk wallpaper, and massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering light over the vanity mirrors. Deep velvet chaise lounges sat in the center of the room, surrounded by fresh white orchids. It was a space built for wealthy women to touch up their makeup and gossip about their peers. Tonight, it would serve as the stage for my mother's final, desperate performance. Barbara released my arm and immediately dropped to her knees, checking under the stalls to ensure the room was completely empty. She checked every corner, her paranoia radiating off her in invisible waves. Once she was satisfied we were entirely alone, she turned back to me. The aggressive, demanding mother vanished in a fraction of a second. It was a masterful transition. Her shoulders slumped, her chest heaved with a sudden, jagged breath, and tears instantly sprang to her eyes. She was deploying her ultimate weapon, the weeping mother routine. "Oh, Jessica," she sobbed, bringing the back of her hand to her forehead in a gesture of profound suffering. "You have to understand the pressure we are under. You have to forgive us for being so short with you today. We are incredibly terrified, and you are the only one who can save this family." I remained motionless near the marble sinks, watching her performance with clinical detachment. 10 years ago, those fake tears would have destroyed me. I would have done anything to comfort her. I would have emptied my bank accounts just to make her stop crying. But today, I saw right through the transparent manipulation. I noticed her eyes weren't actually red. I noticed she was very careful not to smear her expensive mascara. She was acting. She was playing a role designed to bypass my defenses and secure my compliance. I didn't say a word. I let the silence hang in the air, forcing her to keep talking to fill the void. My mother took a step closer, reaching out to grasp my hands. Her palms were clammy and cold. "Jessica, please, you must understand why we need you to do this for William. The bank is going to take our house." The words tumbled out of her mouth, blending into a desperate torrent of half-truths. "Your father and I are months behind on the mortgage. We took out a massive loan against the property to help William with his business 2 years ago. We thought he was going to build an empire. We thought he was going to elevate the Vance family name to the absolute pinnacle of New York society." She paused, letting out a dramatic wail that echoed loudly off the marble walls. "But the business failed. Jessica, it completely failed, and William is in serious trouble. He owes a lot of money to very bad people. If he doesn't pay them by tomorrow morning, they are going to hurt him. They might hurt Madison and Little Mason. We are absolutely desperate." I kept my facial muscles completely relaxed. I didn't show shock. I didn't show anger. I simply looked into her calculating eyes. "So you knew?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You knew he altered the catering contract to steal $13,500 from my credit card." My mother didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She squeezed my hands tighter, shaking them for emphasis. "It isn't stealing, Jessica," she pleaded, her logic completely warped by desperation. "It is a temporary reallocation of funds. William just needs the cash to refinance his debt and get those dangerous people off his back. He has a brilliant plan to invest the remaining money and make it all back tenfold. You are just providing the bridge loan to keep him safe. You want me to take on $18,000? $500 in high-interest credit card debt so your white son-in-law can pay off his illegal gambling debts? I stated, laying out the raw, ugly facts without any sugarcoating. Do not use that tone with me, my mother snapped, her fake tears vanishing for a second before she forced them back. Don't you understand the burden he carries? William is the only one who brings any real prestige to this family. He is a corporate banker. He moves in circles we could never access without him. He gave Madison a respectable life. He gave us a beautiful mixed-race grandson. We have to protect him at all costs. We cannot let him go to jail or get hurt over a temporary financial hiccup. She dropped my hands and began pacing the plush rug, her heels sinking into the deep pile. She was gearing up for the final blow, the ultimate insult designed to put me exactly in my place. Look at your life, Jessica, she said, gesturing wildly in my direction. Look at what you have. You don't have a husband. You don't have children. You work in a dirty little shop arranging cheap balloons and party favors. What exactly is your money for? You have absolutely no legacy to protect. You have no status to maintain. We are trying to save the only respectable branch of this family. You need to sacrifice a little for your blood. You should feel honored that we trust you enough to ask for your help. The absolute magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She truly believed my life was completely worthless, simply because I didn't have a man standing next to me. She believed my hard-earned money belonged to a gambling addict simply because he had a corporate job title and pale skin. She was entirely willing to destroy my financial future to protect her own fabricated social status. She stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me again, looking at me with a mix of hope and entitlement. Just let the venue process the charge, she whispered, leaning in close. Just go home and stay quiet. Be the good, obedient daughter for once in your life. Save your family, Jessica. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and ugly. I looked at the woman who had just confessed to actively participating in a massive financial fraud against her own daughter. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I slowly reached out and grabbed her wrist. I wrapped my fingers around her arm and squeezed with a cold, calculated pressure. My mother gasped slightly. Her eyes went wide with surprise at my sudden physical dominance. I peeled her fingers off my arm, moving her hand away from my body with slow, deliberate force. It is fine, I said, my voice sounding completely foreign, even to my own ears. It was a voice made of pure ice. I will have this handled entirely by tomorrow morning. My mother let out a massive sigh of relief, a genuine smile finally breaking through her panicked expression. Oh, Jessica, thank you. Thank you so much. I knew you would finally do the right thing. Your father and I are so proud of you. I didn't wait for her to finish. I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy wooden door of the powder room. I pulled it open and stepped out into the brightly lit marble hallway, leaving her alone among the white orchids and silk wallpaper. I walked down the corridor, my mind operating with absolute, lethal clarity. I now possessed the holy trinity of vengeance. I had the digital proof of the forged signature on my venue's contract. I had the crystal-clear audio recording of William attempting to extort my general manager for cash. And now I had the final, undeniable confirmation of my parents' toxic complicity. They knew everything, and they chose to sacrifice me anyway. They thought they had won. They thought I was going to quietly absorb the debt and fade back into my miserable little life. They didn't have the faintest idea that I was not the victim in this scenario. I was the executioner, and the countdown to their complete and total destruction had officially begun. I stepped out of the Astor Room into the warm New York evening, ready to orchestrate the greatest downfall my family had ever seen. The night faded into a bruised purple dawn as I sat alone in the center of my glass-enclosed corner office. I hadn't slept a minute, but I didn't feel a fraction of fatigue. The city of Manhattan stretched out beneath my feet, its streetlights slowly giving way to the rising sun. I was holding a mug of black coffee, letting the bitter heat anchor me to present reality. My massive mahogany desk was completely bare except for my primary workstation. 3 draft emails glowed against the dark, high-resolution screen. They were the digital execution orders I had spent the entire night meticulously constructing. I watched the digital clock in the corner of my monitor tick over to 6:00 a.m. I had exactly 12 minutes left before the business day officially began for my corporate divisions and the federal agencies I was about to contact. I opened the first draft addressed to the head of security for the Astor Room. His name was John, the same man who managed my entire private security apparatus. The subject line was simply, Level 1 Event Cancellation Protocol. I had attached the formal legal notice revoking Madison Vance's event permit due to extreme contractual fraud and payment discrepancies. My instructions to John were absolute and unforgiving. He was to immediately lock down the grand ballroom and all adjacent VIP suites. He was to secure heavy steel chains across the main brass doors, preventing any physical entry from the street. He was to post termination of service notices on every entrance. Citing fraudulent financial activity as the specific cause for cancellation, I specifically mandated that a full tactical security detachment remain on site to turn away any vendor, guest, or family member who attempted to bypass the lockdown. Madison thought she owned my venue for the night. She thought she was the queen of the ballroom. By noon, she wouldn't even be able to step onto the public sidewalk outside the building without my security team turning her away. The second email was directed to a high-level contact within the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. It wasn't a standard, anonymous police report filed through a public portal. It was a fully realized prosecutorial package, delivered directly to a federal director I frequently worked with during complex corporate acquisitions. I had attached the digital copy of the altered venue contract, highlighting the specific IP address that proved William had accessed the administrative system from his own home network. I included David's forensic breakdown of the attempted embezzlement, the routing numbers of the predatory loan sharks, and the exhaustive paper trail of my parents' depleted equity. The crown jewel of the package was the audio file I had recorded from my security suite. William's own frantic voice begging the manager for $13,500 in cash to save his legs from violent loan sharks. It was irrefutable, concrete proof of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal extortion. I detailed how he had used my personal business credentials to attempt this massive theft. William had effectively signed his own federal arrest warrant, and I was hand-delivering it to the authorities. The third and final email was perhaps the most ruthless action I had taken in my entire professional career. It was addressed to the Senior Director of Distressed Asset Acquisition for my own private holding group. The target was the primary residence of Charles and Barbara Vance. David had provided the exact routing details of the second mortgage my parents had defaulted on. The predatory private lenders who held their debt were notoriously aggressive, but they were also highly susceptible to sudden, massive all-cash buyouts. My email authorized my acquisition firm to initiate an immediate, hostile takeover of my parents' mortgage. I instructed my financial team to pay whatever premium was necessary to secure the debt paper by the end of the business day. They were authorized to bypass all standard negotiation protocols and simply flood the lenders with cash. Once my company owned their debt, I would have absolute legal authority to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings and freeze all their remaining assets. They had willingly sacrificed my financial security to protect their social image. They had looked me in the eye and demanded I bleed for them. I was simply returning the favor, legally acquiring the roof over their heads and stripping them of their final sanctuary. The digital clock on my monitor shifted to 6:11. I took one last sip of my coffee. The liquid was completely cold, but I didn't care. My mind was perfectly still, operating with the terrifying calm of a surgeon preparing to amputate a cancerous limb. There was no hesitation, no lingering guilt, no sudden surge of family obligation washing over me. Those useless emotions had died yesterday in the powder room. My mother had cornered me in a bathroom and demanded I ruin myself for a man who was actively robbing me. My father had threatened to disinherit me over a catering bill. My sister had treated me like a peasant in my own building. My nephew had thrown dirty clothes in my face. They had collectively decided that I was nothing more than an acceptable casualty in their desperate war to maintain a fake, wealthy aesthetic. They had mistaken my lifelong silence for weakness. They had mistaken my simple decoy shop for failure. The clock struck exactly 6:12 a.m. I moved my mouse and clicked send on the first email. I clicked send on the second email. I clicked send on the third email. The screen refreshed, showing all 3 messages successfully delivered into the digital ether. The trapdoor had swung open miles away. In the wealthy suburbs they could no longer afford, my family was waking up blissfully unaware of the financial and legal apocalypse hurtling toward them at breakneck speed. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and allowed myself to picture the morning unfolding in their chaotic rented spaces. Madison was undoubtedly sitting at her brightly lit vanity, surrounded by cheap counterfeit cosmetics she pretended were imported from Paris. She was probably sipping discounted sparkling wine out of a crystal flute, taking heavily filtered photos for her social media followers. She would be barking vicious, degrading orders at whatever unfortunate freelance stylist she had hired for the morning, complaining about the lighting and admiring her fake designer dress. She firmly believed she was the absolute queen of New York society, getting ready for her ultimate coronation tonight. She didn't have the faintest idea that her royal palace was being chained shut by my private security team. She didn't have the faintest idea that her highly curated guest list was going to arrive at a dark, locked building plastered with fraud notices. In the adjacent bedroom, William was likely standing in front of his closet, sweating through his undershirt as he stared at his collection of tailored navy blue suits. He was probably checking his mobile banking app every 5 minutes, waiting for the massive cash injection he thought he had successfully stolen from me yesterday. He probably thought his intense panic from the venue walkthrough was just a temporary hiccup. He believed forcing me to swipe my black card had solved all his fatal problems. He told himself he was an ultimate survivor, a brilliant corporate operator who had easily outmaneuvered his uneducated event planner, sister-in-law. He was completely unaware that a team of federal investigators was opening a secure file containing his full verbal confession and preparing to dispatch agents to his location. He thought he was putting on a luxury suit for a lavish party, but he was actually getting dressed for his own federal indictment. Across town, in the pristine suburban home they had lived in for 30 years, Barbara and Charles were beginning their own morning rituals of absolute delusion. My father was likely standing in the grand foyer, practicing his golf swing, and admiring his reflection in the gilded hallway mirror. He was congratulating himself on being the strong, uncompromising patriarch who had successfully bullied his rebellious youngest daughter into submission. He thought his aggressive, abusive tactics had saved the family reputation and secured his position in the neighborhood hierarchy. My mother was probably sitting in her master bedroom, clasping a cubic zirconia necklace around her throat and marveling at her own manipulative brilliance. She thought her dramatic crying performance in the bathroom had been a masterpiece of emotional extortion. She firmly believed her fake tears had secured her salvation and funded her favorite grandson's party. They were happily getting dressed and applying expensive perfumes in a house they technically no longer owned. They were making grand plans for a future that had just been legally acquired by my corporate holding group. And Mason, the spoiled, entitled nephew who had thrown his jacket directly in my face, was probably still lying in his messy bed, scrolling endlessly on his phone. He was likely drafting highly arrogant captions for the photos he planned to take at the venue tonight, bragging about his generational wealth and elite social status. He thought he was completely untouchable, protected by a magic bubble of family money that didn't actually exist anywhere outside his collective imagination. He had no idea his grand 18th birthday celebration was already an active crime scene, and that his entire reality was a pathetic illusion funded by extreme debt and desperate wire fraud. I leaned back in my chair and watched as the morning sun completely broke the horizon, flooding my spacious office with a brilliant, blinding golden light. The massive city of New York was waking up to a beautiful, clear morning. My encrypted phone sat completely silent on the edge of the mahogany desk. There were no furious text messages, no panicked phone calls, no demands for free labor. The silence in the room was absolute perfection. The members of my family were simply going about their mornings, smiling into their various mirrors, fixing their hair, and strapping on their fake luxury armor. They were marching happily and willingly into a solid brick wall at top speed. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity or regret, but I found absolutely nothing. I had given them every conceivable opportunity to treat me with basic human decency over the last 30 years. I had stayed out of their way. I had let them enjoy their delusions of grandeur. I had never rubbed my actual, massive wealth in their faces. But they couldn't just leave me alone. They had actively chosen to treat me like prey. They had hunted me down at my decoy office and tried to consume my livelihood to feed their insatiable vanity. Now they were about to discover the most brutal lesson of all. They were about to find out exactly what happens when the supposed prey turns out to be the apex predator of the entire ecosystem. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the crisp lines of my tailored jacket, and walked slowly toward my private elevator. I had a very busy and highly entertaining day ahead of me, and I wanted to be in the front row when the first massive domino finally crashed to the ground. The afternoon sun beat down on the flawless pavement outside the Astor Room. I sat comfortably in the back of my black-tinted Cadillac Escalade, parked precisely across the street from the main entrance. My chauffeur had secured the perfect vantage point, giving me an unobstructed view of the impending disaster. I held a tablet in my lap, streaming the live, high-definition audio from the discreet security microphones mounted above the brass doors. The trap was set, and the first wave of victims was beginning to arrive. Right at 4 o'clock, Luxury vehicles began pulling into the roundabout. Valets, who were actually my undercover security personnel in impeccable uniforms, stepped forward to open the doors. The guest list Madison had curated was a desperate attempt to appear vital to New York society. Minor local politicians, mid-level bank executives, and wealthy neighborhood gossips stepped out of their vehicles, wearing expensive afternoon dresses and tailored suits. They expected to be ushered into a lavish paradise of free champagne and Wagyu beef. Instead, they were met with a physical blockade of absolute, undeniable rejection. The heavy glass and brass front doors of the Astor Room were wrapped tightly in thick, industrial steel chains. The metal links glinted harshly in the sunlight, a brutal contrast to the elegant architecture. A massive, heavy-duty padlock secured the chains. Taped directly to the glass at eye level were bright orange legal notices. The bold black text declared the event officially canceled due to severe contract violations and active financial fraud. Standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the chained doors was a line of 6 massive security guards. They wore immaculate black suits with discreet earpieces, and their faces were entirely devoid of any emotion. They were not standard event bouncers. They were elite tactical personnel employed directly by my holding group. I had personally selected them for their intimidating presence and their absolute refusal to tolerate disrespect. John was standing a few steps behind them, arms crossed, watching the growing crowd with the cold detachment of a military commander. Confusion rippled through the gathered crowd of elite guests. Women in designer heels stumbled slightly as they halted, their faces transitioning from polite smiles to genuine bewilderment. Men in linen suits pointed at the orange notices, reading the words financial fraud aloud to their wives. The low murmur of polite conversation quickly escalated into a loud, buzzing swarm of gossip and outrage. People started pulling out their phones, taking pictures of the chained doors and the grim security team. Madison's carefully constructed social facade was already bleeding out onto the concrete before she had even arrived. 10 minutes later, a massive, rented white stretch limo rounded the corner and lumbered into the roundabout. It was an incredibly tacky vehicle, the kind usually reserved for rowdy prom nights, but Madison undoubtedly thought it projected absolute royalty. The chauffeur put the car in park and walked around to open the rear passenger door. Madison stepped out first, pausing for a brief second as if expecting a barrage of camera flashes. She wore a bright red floor-length gown that was completely inappropriate for an afternoon birthday party. It was a cheap designer knockoff covered in fake crystals that caught the sunlight in an aggressive, blinding way. She smiled broadly, ready to greet her adoring public. But as her eyes focused on the scene in front of her, the smile slid off her face and shattered. William stepped out next, emerging from the limo in his flawless navy blue suit. He adjusted his cuffs and puffed out his chest, playing the role of the wealthy patriarch providing for his family. He looked around, expecting to see guests sipping champagne in the lobby. Instead, he saw 150 confused, angry people standing on the hot pavement, staring at a line of security guards in steel chains. The blood drained from William's face so fast he looked physically ill. The reality of his failure was staring him directly in the eyes. Mason jumped out of the back, wearing the wrinkled, tailored jacket he had thrown at me yesterday. He held his phone up, clearly intending to live stream his grand entrance. He stopped dead in his tracks, his phone hovering in the air as he took in the locked doors and the whispering crowd. His friends, the elite private schoolboys he had promised a night of limitless luxury, were standing at the front of the crowd, pointing and laughing at the giant orange fraud notices. Mason's arrogant smirk melted into an expression of profound teenage humiliation. Charles and Barbara brought up the rear, struggling slightly to exit the low vehicle. My father wore a stiff golf jacket, his face already red from the afternoon heat. My mother clutched her fake designer bag to her chest, her eyes darting frantically from the crowd to the chained doors. She recognized the disaster instantly, but her brain actively refused to process it. Madison shoved her way through the murmuring guests, her heavy dress dragging aggressively against the pavement. She marched right up to the line of security guards, her face contorted into a mask of pure, absolute entitlement. I turned up the volume on my tablet, letting her shrill voice fill the quiet interior of my SUV. "What is the meaning of this?" Madison shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the heavy steel chains. "Open these doors immediately. I am the hostess of this event. You are ruining my son's birthday party. Do you have any idea how much money I am spending here today?" The lead guard, a massive man named John, simply looked down at her. He didn't move a single muscle. His voice boomed over the exterior microphones, deep and entirely unbothered. "This event has been officially canceled, ma'am. You and your guests must leave the premises immediately. Madison let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. Cancelled, she yelled, her voice cracking with hysteria. You cannot cancel my event. The bill was paid yesterday. My sister swiped her card. I watched it happen. Go get your manager right now. I demand to speak to the person in charge. You are all going to be fired for this level of disrespect. John didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The venue manager is unavailable, ma'am. The cancellation orders came directly from the top. The building is locked down due to confirmed financial fraud associated with your booking party. Please instruct your guests to vacate the property. The word fraud echoed loudly in the roundabout. The surrounding guests gasped audibly. Several women covered their mouths, leaning in to whisper to their husbands. Madison's social standing was actively vaporizing in the humid summer air. She looked around wildly, seeing the judgment and pity in the eyes of the people she had tried so desperately to impress. Her face turned a deep, mottled purple. William pushed past his wife, stepping directly into John's personal space. William was a tall man, but he looked completely pathetic trying to intimidate the towering security professional. He puffed out his chest, deploying his ultimate weapon of perceived superiority. He was about to play his WASP corporate privilege card, fully expecting the security team to cower before his banker aesthetic. Listen to me, you incompetent thug, William barked, his voice dripping with venom and fake authority. I am a senior vice president at a major financial institution. I personally arranged the contract for this venue. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Bring your manager out here right now. Do you have any idea who I am? John looked down at William with an expression of mild disgust. He leaned slightly forward, towering over the panicking banker. We know exactly who you are, Mr. Miller. We also know exactly what you did with the contract. We don't take orders from managers, and we certainly don't take orders from you. We only take orders from the chairman, sir, and the chairman wants you off this property. William stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. The mention of his contract tampering broke his facade entirely. He knew that they knew. The venue wasn't just closed, it was a trap. His eyes darted around the parking lot, frantically searching for the dangerous loan sharks he owed money to. He realized he was out in the open, completely exposed, with absolutely zero cash and no way to pay his debts. He started hyperventilating, his hands shaking violently as he tugged at his expensive silk tie. Mason was standing by the limo, his face burning with shame. His friends were openly mocking him now, recording his family being publicly humiliated by the security team. Mason turned to his mother, his voice whiny and aggressive. Mom, fix this right now. You promised me the best party in the city. Everyone is laughing at me. You are embarrassing me in front of my entire crew. Do something useful for once. Madison spun around and slapped Mason hard on the arm, her own panic boiling over into misplaced rage. Shut up, Mason, she hissed frantically. Can't you see we are dealing with a massive misunderstanding? Just go wait in the limo. Charles and Barbara were frozen near the back of the crowd, entirely unable to process the scene. My father stared at the bright orange fraud notices, his jaw working silently. He knew William had altered the contract, but he never expected to face public consequences. He thought his mere presence would force the world to bend to his wishes. Now he was standing on a hot sidewalk, watching his golden son-in-law crumble into a pathetic, shaking mess, while strangers whispered about his criminal behavior. Barbara was in a state of absolute terror. She grabbed Charles's arm, her acrylic nails digging into his jacket. Charles, do something, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Call Jessica. Tell her to get down here and fix this mess. She promised me yesterday she would take care of it. She told me to my face it would all be handled. My father pulled his phone from his pocket, his thick fingers fumbling as he dialed my number. I watched the screen of my personal phone light up on the seat next to me. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I made no move to answer it. I simply watched the live feed on my tablet, observing his face as the call went straight to my encrypted voicemail. She isn't answering, Charles barked, hanging up and dialing again. The little brat is sending me straight to voicemail. Barbara snatched her own phone from her designer bag, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it onto the pavement. She scrambled to pick it up, ignoring the bizarre looks from the remaining guests. She dialed my number, holding the phone tightly against her ear. I watched her face contort in mounting horror as she, too, was sent straight to my voicemail. She's ignoring us, Barbara cried, her voice cracking with genuine fear. Why would she do this? Why would she humiliate Madison like this in front of all these important people? She knows William needs that money today. She knows what will happen if he doesn't get it. I sat in the cool, air-conditioned comfort of my SUV, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. They were finally realizing that their invisible, obedient scapegoat had orchestrated their public execution. They were finally starting to understand that my promise to handle it meant handling them permanently. They had backed me into a corner and expected me to die quietly for their benefit. They had no idea I possessed the resources to buy their entire reality and crush it with my bare hands. The guests were rapidly losing interest in the spectacle and gaining interest in self-preservation. The word fraud, coupled with the aggressive security presence, was enough to send the elite socialites scurrying back to their luxury vehicles. They did not want to be associated with a criminal investigation. The roundabout turned into a chaotic mess of backing cars and slamming doors, as Madison's carefully curated audience abandoned her entirely. Madison was screaming at the departing cars, begging them to stay, promising it was just a minor administrative glitch. William was leaning heavily against the side of the rented limo, clutching his chest and breathing hard. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the predators waiting in the shadows. Mason had retreated into the back of the limo, hiding his face in his hands, completely destroyed by the public rejection of his peers. My parents stood in the center of the roundabout, entirely alone amidst the chaos. Barbara was weeping openly now, her fake tears replaced by genuine terror as she continued to dial my number over and over. Charles was pacing in a tight circle, his face a mask of impotent rage, yelling at the security guards, who simply ignored his existence. The grand illusion of the Vance family was dead, completely shattered on the pavement outside my building. But the show wasn't over yet. The final act was about to arrive. I rolled down the tinted window of my SUV just a fraction of an inch, letting the thick, humid summer air seep into the cabin. I wanted to hear this part with my own ears, without the filter of the security microphones. I wanted to feel the vibration in the air. From the main intersection just 2 blocks away, the sudden, piercing wail of multiple sirens cut through the afternoon air. The sound started as a distant shriek and rapidly amplified into a deafening roar. The remaining guests in the roundabout froze, turning their heads toward the noise. William snapped his head up, his eyes wide with absolute, primal terror. He stumbled away from the limo, frantically looking for somewhere to run, but his legs seemed unable to support his weight. 3 heavily marked police cruisers rounded the corner, their tires screeching against the asphalt. Their red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly in the afternoon sun, casting harsh, erratic shadows across my family's faces. The cruisers didn't slow down to investigate. They accelerated aggressively toward the Astor Room, executing a perfectly coordinated tactical maneuver. The first cruiser slammed on its brakes in front of the roundabout's main exit, effectively blocking the rented limo's movement. The second and third cruisers blocked the rear entrance, sealing off any possible escape route. The parking lot was instantly locked down, flooded with flashing lights and the blinding glare of police spotlights. William dropped to his knees on the pavement, his hands going automatically to the back of his head. He wasn't a hardened criminal, he was a cowardly corporate thief, and the sight of the police completely broke what little fragile spirit he had left. He started sobbing loudly, a pathetic, miserable sound that echoed over the dying wail of the sirens. Madison was frozen. Her bright red dress made her a perfect target in the center of the flashing lights. She stared at the cruisers with her mouth open in silent disbelief. Her grand social event had gone from a closed-door embarrassment to a full-blown criminal raid in under 20 minutes. My father stumbled backward, bumping into my mother, who was covering her face in horror. They looked like statues carved out of pure dread. They had willingly participated in William's fraud. They knew about his extortion and had tried to force me to fund his escape. They were suddenly realizing that when the police investigate massive wire fraud, they look at everyone involved in the money trail. I leaned back against the soft leather seats of my SUV, rolling the window back up to isolate the noise of shouting officers. I picked up my cold coffee mug, taking a satisfied sip. The execution was proceeding exactly as planned. The forged signature, the extortion recording, and the predatory loan data were all safely in the hands of the authorities. The buyout of my parents' home mortgage was already being processed through my corporate acquisitions firm. They had demanded a sacrifice for their blood. I had simply decided to ensure it was their blood spilled on the altar. I tapped the glass of my window, signaling my chauffeur to quietly pull away. The Vance family didn't need me anymore. They had the police to keep them company. I had an empire to run, and I wasn't going to let their pathetic downfall ruin the rest of my beautiful afternoon. My chauffeur maneuvered the heavy SUV around the block, seamlessly swapping the vehicle in my secure underground garage for the car I reserved for truly defining moments. The transition took less than 5 minutes, but it gave the police the exact amount of time needed to establish their absolute perimeter. I sat in the spacious rear cabin of my sleek black Maybach, smoothing the fabric of my bespoke power suit. The charcoal fabric was woven with subtle silver threads, projecting an absolute, unyielding authority. I checked my reflection in the tinted glass. I looked exactly like the corporate predator they never saw coming. I gave my chauffeur the signal to head back to the venue. The chaotic scene in the Astor Rooms roundabout was reaching a fever pitch. The police cruisers had completely locked down the perimeter, their lights washing my family's terrified faces in harsh red and blue. The remaining elite guests were huddled near the edges of the property, unable to retrieve their cars, trapped as unwitting witnesses to the unfolding disaster. The heavy purr of the Maybach's engine cut through the noise of the murmuring crowd. The massive black vehicle glided silently into the roundabout, stopping directly behind the police barricade. The mere presence of the luxury car demanded immediate attention. The crowd of panicking socialites instinctively parted, creating a clear, wide path to the main entrance, where my family stood frozen in terror. My chauffeur stepped out quickly, walking around to open my door. I stepped out of the vehicle, planting a stiletto firmly on the pavement. I stood perfectly straight, adjusting the flawless lapels of my jacket. Behind me, 2 of my most ruthless corporate lawyers stepped out of the trail car, carrying leather briefcases filled with the legal documentation of my family's total ruin. I walked slowly through the roundabout, my heels clicking a steady, commanding rhythm against the concrete. I didn't rush. I let the heavy silence stretch as people began to recognize the woman they thought was just a lowly event planner, now flanked by high-powered attorneys and stepping out of a $500,000 vehicle. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from my family. They stared at me with expressions of utter incomprehension. Madison was clutching her ruined fake designer dress, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Barbara and Charles looked as though they were actively hallucinating, unable to bridge the gap between the daughter they abused and the titan standing before them. William was shaking so violently I could hear his short, ragged breaths over the idling of the police cruisers. Mason looked back and forth between his father and me, his arrogant teenage smirk completely erased by genuine fear. Before any of them could find the words to speak, I raised my hand and gestured toward the top of the building. I had given John specific instructions for this exact moment. Above the chained glass doors, the massive digital billboard that usually displayed elegant venue advertisements suddenly went pitch black. A second later, it flashed blindingly bright, illuminating the entire parking lot with crisp white text against a stark black background. The words blazed into the sky for every guest, police officer, and passing car to see. Event canceled. Reason: William Miller. Identity theft and financial fraud. Regards, Chairman Jessica Vance. The collective gasp from the 150 elite VIP guests sounded like a sudden vacuum, sucking all the humid air out of the roundabout. The murmurs erupted into a chaotic symphony of shock and scandal. People were pointing at the giant illuminated sign, reading my name out loud and then looking directly at me standing there in my power suit. I watched absolute devastation wash over my family as their fragile, fabricated reality was violently ripped away. Madison stared at the sign and let out a guttural scream of pure denial. She grabbed her head, shaking it back and forth as if trying to physically dislodge the glowing words from her brain. "Jessica!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "What is this? What have you done? What does that sign say?" I kept my face completely expressionless, radiating nothing but cold corporate efficiency. "I did exactly what I promised Mom in the bathroom," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the noise of the crowd. "I handled it. I told you I would manage the situation entirely. And I have. You wanted me to pay for the party, so I simply canceled it. It is one of the many perks of owning the building." My father took a stumbling step forward, his face losing all its ruddy color. "Owning the building?" he stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "What are you talking about, Jessica? You arrange flowers. You don't own the Astor Room. You have a tiny shop in Queens." "I actually own the entire commercial block, Dad," I replied calmly, folding my hands in front of me. "The flower shop was just a convenient decoy, a place to work where I knew you and Mom would never bother visiting because you considered the neighborhood beneath you. It kept your toxic, insatiable greed away from my real assets. While you were draining the equity out of your house to fund William's illegal gambling addiction, I was building a real estate empire. And speaking of your equity, you should probably read the documents my lawyers brought for you. I gestured to the lawyer on my right. He stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legal papers from his briefcase and shoving them directly into my father's trembling hands. My acquisition firm just bought your distressed mortgage 2 hours ago, I stated loudly, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear every word of their ruin. You are officially in default. You will have to vacate the property by the end of the month. I suggest you start packing your golf shirts immediately, Charles. Barbara let out a high-pitched wail, collapsing heavily against Charles's arm. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the pavement, weeping hysterically. This wasn't a performance. These were genuine tears of absolute terror. She was losing her house, her fake social status, and her golden son-in-law all in the span of 5 minutes. She looked up at me, her makeup smeared and ruined, begging me to tell her it was a cruel joke. She reached a shaking hand toward my shoes, pleading with me to stop this madness, but I offered her absolutely no comfort. I simply looked down at her, watching the consequences of her lifelong cruelty finally take root in the harsh light of day. I turned my attention to Mason, who was cowering against the rented limo. You wanted your Wagyu beef cooked rare, Mason? I said, my tone dripping with icy condescension. I am afraid the kitchen is permanently closed. Perhaps you can ask your father to buy you a burger with the money he tried to steal from me. Try not to be useless while you pack up your bedroom tonight. But the most glorious reaction of the entire afternoon belonged to William. He looked at the giant digital billboard broadcasting his federal crimes to the entire city, and his mind completely broke. The police officers who had been securing the perimeter were now advancing toward our small group, unholstering their handcuffs. The lead detective, a stern-looking woman in a tactical vest, called out William Miller's name. William didn't try to explain himself. He didn't try to play his WASP corporate privilege card like he had with my security guards. The crushing weight of the federal evidence I had provided left him with absolutely no way out. Pure, primal panic hijacked his body. William let out a pathetic, whimpering cry and suddenly bolted. He shoved past Mason, nearly knocking the teenager over, and sprinted frantically toward the exit of the roundabout. He looked incredibly ridiculous, running in his expensive loafers, his arms pumping wildly as he tried to outrun the inevitable consequences of his own arrogance. He thought he could outrun federal wire fraud. He thought he could just disappear into the city and hide from the loan sharks and the police. He barely made it 20 yards. The police officers reacted with immediate tactical precision. 2 burly officers sprinted after him, easily closing the distance. As William tried to dodge around a parked cruiser, one of the officers lunged forward and tackled him directly onto the hard asphalt. The sound of his body hitting the pavement was a heavy, sickening thud that echoed sharply in the roundabout. William let out a loud shriek of pain as his face was pressed firmly into the hot concrete. The officers were on him instantly, wrenching his arms roughly behind his back. William writhed and cried, begging them to let him go, screaming that it was all a massive misunderstanding and he just needed to make a phone call. The officers ignored his pathetic pleas, snapping the heavy metal handcuffs onto his wrists with a sharp, decisive click. They hauled him up aggressively. His impeccable navy blue suit was torn at the shoulder and covered in gray street dirt. His cheek was scraped and bleeding, a stark contrast to the smug, confident expression he had worn in my office just hours prior. Madison was screaming hysterically, trying to run toward her husband, but my private security guard stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall between her and the police. She beat her fists against John's chest, wailing and sobbing, demanding they release her husband because he was a bank vice president. John simply stood there, letting her exhaust herself against his massive frame, completely unmoved by her wealthy housewife routine. Mason was frozen near the limo, his phone dropped and forgotten on the ground. He was watching his father be paraded in front of his wealthy private school friends like a common street criminal. The humiliation was absolute and permanent. The 150 elite guests watched the spectacle with rapt attention, holding up their phones to record the entire downfall. They whispered furiously among themselves, cementing the absolute destruction of the Vance family's reputation in real time. Madison would never again be able to show her face at a country club or a charity gala. William was going to federal prison for a long time. My parents were going to be evicted from their home and forced into poverty. They had spent their entire lives worshiping the illusion of prestige and ignoring basic human decency. And now they had nothing left but public disgrace and crushing debt. I stood in silence, flanked by my lawyers, watching as the police shoved William into the back of a cruiser. He looked at me through the window, his face pressed against the glass, tears streaming down his cheeks. He finally understood that he had tried to extort the absolute wrong woman. I gave him a small, polite wave and turned my back on him. I looked at my mother, still crying on the ground, my father staring at the foreclosure papers in stunned silence, and my sister sobbing uncontrollably against the impassive security guard. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle into my bones. The execution was completely flawless. My empire was entirely safe, and the parasites had been permanently excised from my life. I walked back toward my Maybach, the crowd of elite socialites parting for me with a newfound terror and respect. I slid into the cool, silent luxury interior of the vehicle, leaving the noise and the crying behind. I had just instructed my chauffeur to take me home when I realized the absolute finality of this moment required my physical presence. The destruction of my family couldn't be something I simply watched through a tinted window. It had to be a public execution, and I had to be the one holding the axe. Plus, as my chauffeur began to slowly maneuver the massive Maybach toward the street exit, two figures threw themselves directly into the path of the vehicle. My chauffeur was forced to slam on the brakes, the heavy car stopping abruptly to avoid running them over. I sighed, leaning forward in my plush leather seat and pressing the silver button to lower my tinted window just a few inches. The thick, humid summer air re-entered the silent, climate-controlled cabin, bringing with it the pathetic sounds of their absolute defeat. Barbara and Charles had fallen heavily to their knees on the unforgiving asphalt of the roundabout. They were sobbing violently, their hands reaching out and gripping the edge of my open window frame. "Jessica, please," Barbara wailed, her voice entirely stripped of its usual arrogant polish. Her false eyelashes were peeling off, and her face was a ruined mess of mascara and profound panic. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take our house. We are your parents, Jessica. We gave you life. We raised you in a good home. You have to show us some mercy. We are blood." My father was weeping openly now, his fragile, toxic pride completely broken and left in the dirt. "We will do anything, Jessica," he pleaded, looking at me with terrified, bloodshot eyes. He looked like a frail old man stripped of his golf jacket and blustering authority. "Just give us the house back, please. Don't leave us out here with nothing. We will change. We will treat you better. Just please call the bank and stop this." I looked at the two people who had spent my entire existence making me feel microscopic. I looked at the hands that had taken my hard-earned money and given it to a golden child. I searched my soul for a single drop of mercy or family obligation. I searched for any lingering trace of the obedient daughter who used to crave their validation. There was absolutely nothing left inside me but cold corporate clarity. "You left me with nothing for 30 years, I stated, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "You built your entire lives on my silent suffering. You are not experiencing a tragedy, Charles. You are simply experiencing the return on your investment." I reached out and gently peeled my mother's trembling fingers off the expensive glass of my window. I pressed the button, and the heavily tinted window rolled up smoothly and silently, permanently cutting off their frantic screams. I tapped the soundproof glass partition, and my chauffeur expertly maneuvered around their kneeling figures, pulling out onto the main road and leaving them in the rearview mirror forever. 3 months passed with the rapid, beautiful efficiency of a perfectly executed business plan. The spectacular implosion of the Vance family was finalized without a single hitch. William had desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal, but his efforts were completely futile. Federal prosecutors, armed with my airtight digital evidence and his own recorded confession, refused to offer him any leniency. He is currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence for felony wire fraud and identity theft in a medium-security federal prison. He had traded his tailored navy blue suits for a standard bright orange jumpsuit. His career in corporate banking was permanently destroyed, and his elite country club friends had completely erased his name from their collective memories. He spent his days scrubbing cafeteria floors for pennies an hour, a fitting wage for a man who thought he could steal thousands. Madison was forced to face a harsh, exhausting reality she had spent her entire life running from. Without William's stolen income and with her social status completely vaporized, she had no choice but to enter the job market. I occasionally allowed myself the brief, private entertainment of imagining her new daily routine. The woman who once demanded rare Wagyu beef and imported orchids was now standing at the drive-through window of a regional fast food chain. She worked 40 hours a week, wearing a stiff polyester uniform and a greasy headset, taking lunch orders from the exact same neighborhood housewives she used to look down on. She was a single mother living in a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment, completely drowning in the aggressive debt she had accumulated, buying counterfeit designer dresses and fake luxury bags. Mason had been forced to drop out of his elite private school and enroll in the local public high school, where his former friends bullied him relentlessly online for his dramatic fall from grace. Barbara suffered an equally poetic and miserable fate. When my corporate eviction team arrived at their sprawling suburban mansion on that fateful Monday morning, they were given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. They were forced to pack whatever clothes and cheap belongings they could carry into black plastic garbage bags, while my security personnel watched them. They now lived in a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The oppressive heat of the cramped, unair-conditioned space and the constant, deafening noise of the nearby highway were a daily, permanent reminder of their catastrophic failure. Charles worked as a greeter at a hardware store, while Barbara tried to sell her fake diamond jewelry to local pawn shops just to pay their utility bills. They had no golf club memberships, no luxury vehicles, and absolutely no family legacy to protect. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new luxury penthouse, letting the crisp, cool autumn breeze wash over me. The brilliant New York City skyline, the magnificent New York City skyline stretched out in every direction beneath my feet, a beautiful electrical grid of infinite power and endless opportunity. I held my tablet in one hand, casually reviewing the final financial details of a massive multi-million-dollar corporate merger my holding company was about to close. The numbers were absolutely perfect. The projections were entirely flawless. My empire was expanding at a rate that would have been completely impossible if I were still carrying the dead weight of my toxic, parasitic family. I took a slow sip of my expensive vintage red wine and looked at the tiny cars moving like insignificant ants on the streets far below. The silence of the penthouse was a magnificent symphony. There was no one left to demand my money. There was no one left to insult my appearance. There was no one left to tell me I was a failure. "Blood does not make a family," I said aloud, my voice echoing into the empty, beautiful night sky. "Respect does. And when people demand that you pay the price for their existence, you don't just cut them off. You show them exactly what they could never afford to be." The final lesson of this narrative is that blood ties do not automatically grant someone a permanent pass to disrespect your boundaries or demand your continuous sacrifices. True self-worth is never defined by the people who refuse to acknowledge your value, even if they are your own relatives. By freeing yourself from the suffocating cycle of emotional manipulation and constant belittlement, you create the space necessary to build your own empire. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation and the ultimate key to achieving absolute independence and protecting your hard-earned peace.